Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Paul Kaufman. I've been the chair of the trustees of the National Jazz Archive since 2013. In fact, I'm due to stand down from this role next month. The National Jazz Archive is a national charity founded in 1988. The archive holds the UK's finest collection of printed and visual material on jazz and related culture, along with an important collection of oral history recordings. Our main archive is based in Loughton, Essex, on the outskirts of London, and there's also a satellite archive based in the city centre campus of Birmingham City University, which is one of the leading centres for jazz research in Europe. Everyone is welcome to freely explore our collections online through our website, and you can subscribe to our free e-newsletter by clicking the tab on the website homepage. We also welcome visitors in person to our premises in Loughton and Birmingham, and we're happy to deal with queries received by email, phone or post. It's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for this evening, Alan Ainsworth. Alan will be talking about one of our important photographic collections. Alan published a book called Sight Readings last year. It has already been widely acknowledged as a definitive book on jazz photography. Alan is also a highly regarded photographer in his own right. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this presentation. I'm going to talk about the work of a photographer called Brian Foskett, whose work is represented in the National Jazz Archive. And I'd like to explore his photography in a little bit of detail, but perhaps before I come on to that, perhaps I could just say a word or two by way of background. And the first thing I'd like to talk about really is just to say, answer the question, what is jazz photography? Some people might think it's a specialized, perhaps even esoteric subject. But the point I always make when I'm talking about jazz photography is that it's very much in the center, in the mainstream of 20th century American photography. The key theme, I think, running through the 20th century, from perhaps Alfred Stieglitz right at the beginning of the century through to people like Robert Frank towards the end, was understanding and defining the American experience through the visual interpretation of the land, its culture and its myths. And jazz was, of course, the first real American art form and is really central to that definition of what is America. And of course, it's the first art form to have been captured entirely by the camera. So the 20th century jazz visual archive, and you can see some examples on the slide here, really covers everything from the first bands in New Orleans right at the beginning of the 20th century through to the modernist period. And it covers a wide range of different styles and a wide range of photographs in very different circumstances, as you can see here from the examples on the slide. It is, in many respects, a unique visual history of musical and social history. Why is it important? I think there's two parts to this question. Why was jazz photography important to fans, and why is it important in terms of our understanding of jazz? Let's take the first question. I'd like to answer the question about how important jazz photography was to fans while looking at this 1938 photograph by Charles Peterson. And what he's done, he set it up in his home. It's a contrived photograph, but it's a portrait of a typical swing fan of the 1930s. And you can see he's listening to the radio, he's moving his body in time with the music, his feet are off the ground, there's a record playing, there's a record store bag hanging on the back of his chair, there are magazines down near his feet. But pinned on the wall are photographs. And I think what this photograph shows is the way in which photography was part of the immersive experience of jazz in the 1930s and the 1940s. Photographs were extremely important to jazz fans. And it's really, in looking at it that way, it's really part of the symbiotic relationship between jazz and photography in America. From the 1930s onwards, photography was central to the development of visual culture in America, and what John Rayburn, a historian of American photography, called the Americans' picture hunger. So jazz photographs were distributed widely in magazines, in newspapers, in publicity shots, even distributed through vending machines. And in this way, it had a tremendous effect on our understanding of jazz. Jazz and photography really came of age in America when cultural assessments of jazz were still fluid. And that allowed the visual image to play a crucial role in shaping perceptions and understanding of jazz. It's not going too far to say that photography helped to define the image of jazz and the image of the jazz musician. However, there were very different styles of jazz photography, and I just like very quickly to identify three because it helps to put Brian Foskett's photography into context. The first I describe as being visualizing jazz as an art world, and here the emphasis is very much on the individual musician, the artistry and accomplishment of individual musicians, and tends to be performance photography, photographs taken during performance on stage. The emphasis is very much on artistic values, and this tends to be the way in which white American photographers approach jazz. And then secondly, there's the idea of jazz as part of the entertainment business, jazz as business. And here we're talking about things like publicity, shots, jazz perhaps in motion pictures, and photographs taken in recording studios, in broadcasts, and stills from movies. And the third area is jazz live. The audiences, the interactions between audiences and the musicians, the spaces in which jazz took place, and the community around which jazz developed. And this type of photography is much more associated with African-American photojournalists who were very keen to capture the community from which jazz musicians came and in which they lived and developed. Now, I mentioned, I distinguish between those three because when we come to look at Brian Foskett's work, which I'll now do, I think what you'll see is that he's very much in the first of those categories. He's looking at jazz as an art form and seeking to visualize it as an art form. So, who was Brian Foskett? Well, his friends called him Freddie, but I didn't know him, so I'm going to call him Brian. He was born in 1940, and therefore he came to jazz as a young man in the mid-50s, and he photographed between about 1959 and 2012 for most of his life. He was always an amateur. He never sold photographs and was little known outside the jazz community until he published his first book in 1997. And he always combined working as a professional photographer, a commercial photographer, with his avocation as a jazz photographer. He was an artistic personality. I spoke a few weeks ago with his sister, who's still alive, and she told me that when he was young, he was always drawing. He had a very artistic eye. He was always interested in capturing visual impressions. And it had been his intention to go to art school, but unfortunately he didn't get to art school, so he went to work in a record shop in Cambridge when he left school, and that widened his horizons. He met students, he joined the Riverside Jazz Band, a local band, and he played drums with that band for most of his life. I think the key thing about Foskett's work is to recognize that he came of age and came to jazz in the 1950s. And this was a transitional period. It was a period in which jazz went through a phase of popularity. Traditional jazz was very popular, but also modern jazz was rising. The dance bands were still operating. And this is when he found jazz and found it to be an exciting music. It's also the period, however, when the Musicians' Union in Britain was restricting quite severely visiting American musicians playing in the United Kingdom. And that meant that a lot of people like Brian Foskett, who came to jazz as adolescents in the 1950s, had never really seen many of their American idols until the second half of the decade. And like many people who found jazz in that period, they idolized the American heroes. They, to some extent, I suppose, they romanticized them because they didn't know them. And it was only in the latter half of the 1950s that they began to play in this country. So he was part of that post-war generation of fans. It was a very wide cross-section of people who were attracted to jazz. Many of them new to jazz, and they were very passionate about the music, often quite partisan about the kinds of jazz which they liked. But this is a transitional period because by the 1960s, popular music had changed, and as we know, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones came along, and that took away a lot of the audience, which in the 50s had been attracted to jazz. He was very eclectic. He didn't just photograph jazz musicians, he also photographed blues and rock musicians. And he went in a wide variety of venues, from Ronnie Scott's in London, festivals such as the North Sea Jazz Festival, and he even went to the US on a number of occasions, as well as photographing in local clubs in Cambridge. So that's a bit of background, but let's move on quickly now and have a look at his actual photography and see what we can, how we can interpret it and understand what he was trying to do. I think the first thing to say is that jazz for Brian Foskett was essentially to be found in live performance. The vast majority of his work, you'll see this if you look at the National Jazz Archive collection, are photographs taken in performance, and he's focusing almost completely on the musicians as they play. And what he's aiming to do in this type of photography is to express visually an art form, a musical art form, in the process of creation, because of course jazz is very much an improvised music, and the musicians are, in a sense, recreating jazz every night on the bandstand. And it's in the creation of the music that you capture the essence of jazz. And I think this is what he's trying to do. He's seeing jazz as an art form. He's seeing it being created on the stage, and he's trying to capture that engagement of the musicians by the expressions on their faces, their bodily posture, the way they hold their instruments, the way they stand on the stage. It's all about capturing the embodiment of the music. So these two photographs here, Oscar Peterson on the left and Buck Clayton on the right, you can see how he's trying to capture that moment of creation. And here are a couple of others, John Dankworth, taken in 1964, and Ella Fitzgerald. Again, shots taken during the process, during performance. It's only very occasionally, really, that we see in Foskett's work informal shots like these. On the left, there's a portrait of Nat King Cole, on the right, Stan Kenton. And these are very unusual in his work. He didn't really go in for photography like this. He wanted to capture the musicians on stage. There are just one or two where he widens the angle a little bit, and you can get a sense of the context. So the photograph on the left is the mercurial Tubby Hayes playing at Ronnie Scott's first club. And it's unusual because we get a sense of the context in which the performance is taking place. You can see a few members of the audience, and they appear to be as wrapped up in the music as Hayes was himself. You get a sense of the club. We can see it's a pretty sparsely furnished club. We know that all of Ronnie Scott's emphasis was on the music and on the relationship, the intimacy of the place, the relationship between the musicians and the audience. The photograph on the right shows Duke Ellington signing a photograph for a fan. And again, it gives you a sense of the relationship between the musicians and the audience, but these are unusual. These aren't really what he was looking to do. What Foskett was looking to do primarily was to capture the visual aspects of an improvised music in which the music is the musician. And I found a sentence in Bruce Turner's autobiography. Bruce Turner was a notable saxophonist in the 50s and 60s, played with Humphrey Lyttelton and a number of other bands, as well as being a fine player in his own right. And in his autobiography, he says, improvisation can be written down, but jazz can't. it's the intimate personal style of the performer that matters in jazz. And that's what Brian Foskett, I think, was trying to do. He was trying to capture and improvise music through the musicians. So the photograph of Ronnie Scott on the left, I think, does precisely this. You get a sense of a musician whose lifelong commitment to jazz made him such a pioneering figure in the modernist movement in the 50s and 60s, as well as being a famous club owner. I think that Foskett knew that capturing the musician in the act of creation can evoke not just the visual aspects of jazz, but also the sounds of jazz performance. They recreate, they evoke the sounds. And in fact, I found a quotation from Ronnie Scott himself, which I think is interesting in this respect. He said, "The attraction that jazz musicians have for photographers is understandable when one considers that both are concerned with the moment. This affinity seems specifically confined to jazz music." And I think Brian Foskett knew that, and I think that's what he was trying to do. It's interesting that as a professional photographer in his day-to-day, in his day job, he would never accept assignments for weddings because they weren't spontaneous. It was all posed. And for Foskett, spontaneity was the essence of jazz. Well, we can see then, looking at these photographs, how he's focusing on the individual musicians, capturing expressions, looking to visualize the way in which they're engaged in the music. And one of the ways in which he does this is by very, very tight framing. Virtually, not all, but a very significant number, perhaps 85, 90% of Foskett's archive shows photographs of musicians in performance, very, very tightly framed. Nina Simone on the left there. But I'd just like you to look at the photograph of Harry Sweets Edison on the right. The musician is tightly framed, but look how he's created a frame within a frame by capturing his eye by the way his hands are held. So what you've got is a kind of frame within a frame. The tight framing on the musician draws us in, and then it's almost as if we're looking through to the creation of the music through the musician's eyes. And you can see from these other shots as well, the great Buddy Rich in the middle there, how Brian Foskett was really focusing in on the individual musicians, very, very tightly framing and almost excluding anything else. So by doing this, what he's really doing is making sure that our eye cannot move away from the jazz musician as artist. And that's essentially what he was thinking about every time he photographed jazz musicians. Now, the effect of this approach is largely to decontextualize the subjects that he photographed. We get very little sense of context from Brian Foskett's photography. Think back to the photograph of Tubby Hayes at Ronnie Scott's club. That's very unusual. Most of his photographs are like these you see here, Ron Carter on the left and Clark Terry on the right. They could be anywhere. We don't know where they are. And again, Miles Davis and Jerry Mulligan. It's almost as if what Brian Foskett is trying to do is to take us into this world of artistic creation, this world of improvised music. It's almost a transcendental world, isolated from everything else around it. And this is how he gets to the musician. This is how he gets to the essence of the music. And again, he's picking up the whole time the expressions of the musicians, the way they stand. Miles Davis there in a very, very typical pose. Looking to express through those kinetic gestures the nature of jazz as he understood it. Another way that he does this is by using viewpoint and lighting very carefully. And again, he uses it in such a way as to emphasize the artistry of the musicians and the world in which jazz is created. A large number of his photographs are taken from a low viewpoint. And this helps to kind of emphasize the stature of the players. Stan Getz on the left, a towering figure in British in international and world jazz in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A very low viewpoint heroizes these musicians and brings them to life, brings their stature visually in front of the viewer of the photograph. And he's very good at using lighting as well to pick out in generally dark, from generally dark backgrounds, the individual musician that he wants us to look at. Example, Charlie Watts on the right, playing with his jazz combo at Ronnie Scott's club in 2001. His face has caught the lighting, and I think at that point Brian Foskett knew that that was the moment to release the shutter. And again, you can see from these photographs the way in which Peggy Lee's face has been captured and everything else is thrown into darkness. The low viewpoint that emphasizes James Moody in the middle of a solo. This combination of viewpoint and lighting is part of the technique he used to bring the musician to the viewer of the photographs. I don't want to give the impression that the whole of his archive is that kind of photography. Most of it is, but he did know how to widen the frame, and he did have a very artistic eye, because clearly when you begin to widen the frame, you're bringing more details into the image, and that needs careful composition, and that really demands a very careful eye in the way in which the photograph's composed. He was, as I said at the beginning, a good artist. He possibly might have continued as an artist if things had worked out for him, but you can see the artistic eye and the way in which he uses different elements in the photograph to create a specific vocabulary, visual vocabulary for jazz. The photograph of Duke Ellington on the left nicely frames him within the arch of the church where he was performing. And I think this is deliberate, because this was a concert where Ellington's orchestra were playing from his sacred compositions. And I think that the way Foskett has framed it there helps us to understand the way in which Ellington's sacred work became more important in his life as he got older. I particularly like the photograph of Wynja Manon on the right, because of the way in which he's managed to capture this, to compose this graphical image where the trumpets, the lines of the trumpets come down to focus on the face. You can see his intense eyes as he's playing, but it's also used the lines of the ceiling in the club to create this rather nice black and white graphical composition. This is a very, very distinguished artistic eye at work, and I don't want to lose sight of that by having focused so much on his work photographing individual performers. One of the things that jazz photographers know is that there's always a lot of clutter around on the stage. And if you're not able as a photographer of these types of musicians to isolate them in a black background in the way that Foskett does so much, you have to think carefully about the composition of the photograph so it doesn't appear cluttered. And one of the things that I noticed going through Brian Foskett's archive was just how good he is at using things like microphone stands, music stands, trailing wires, architectural features to create coherent architectonic photographs. So you can see that the middle photograph, Frank West, the way in which the music stand has been, and the line of his flute has been used to frame his face. Same with Flip Phillips on the right. And this, I think, is indicative of a photographer who is able to compose artistic and coherent compositions through the viewfinder. I hope that's given an impression of Brian Foskett's work. It's a very distinguished body of work. I hope by setting it by mentioning his background in the 1950s helps to explain why he approached jazz photography in the way he did. But it's a very interesting body of work. If you're interested to see more, you can obviously see it online at the National Jazz Archive site. I end with a photograph of Mick Jagger taken in 1964, because in a sense that is the transitional period that I talked about at the beginning, when the huge popularity of jazz declined and pop and rock replaced it in the affections of a lot of young people. But not Brian Foskett, because he continued photographing jazz musicians virtually until the end of his life, and created this very distinguished archive, which the National Jazz Archive is very, very proud indeed to present to people. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop there, if I may, and I will ask Paul.
Well, thank you, Alan, for that fascinating insight into this amazing collection.